right, we'll get started. So, the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance is happy to welcome you all to our last fall 2023 Watershed Wednesday webinar. So these have been happening on the first Wednesday of the month from October to December, and we've had some great speakers so far. These webinars bring in experts from the field to talk about various watershed topics, and they provide the opportunity for you to learn something new and ask questions over your lunch hour. My name is Jill Peterson. I'm a watershed planning technician here at NSWA, and it's my pleasure to be your host this hour. The other thing I'll note is that we've got a few of our photo contest submissions interspersed throughout the slideshow today, so you can take a look at some of those. And our topic today is how healthy is the river? A look inside the WaterSHED Monitoring Program with speakers Mike Christensen and Dr. Craig Emmerton. They'll be speaking about their role in the North Saskatchewan River Watershed Monitoring Program. This program features an extensive 20-station network monitoring water quality and quantity throughout the watershed. And this tributary monitoring network was created through the partnership of the Alberta government, EPCOR, the City of Edmonton, and us at NSWA. So just going through a few housekeeping items to let you all know that this webinar will be recorded. You can also check out the recording on our YouTube channel and see our two previous Watershed Wednesdays on the channel as well. And to please keep your microphone muted and turned off and video turned off during the presentation. Also to note that you can leave your questions in the chat for both of our speakers, and we will have a Q&A period at the final end part of both presentations. And feedback is encouraged. Okay. We also have our Watershed Wednesday gift basket with our custom NSWA, some of our classic swag. So stay tuned, and Kayla will be announcing the winner at the end of the webinar. So today I'm speaking to you all from NSWA's office and in Miskatchewan, Waskahigan, meeting Beaver Hills House in Cree. It's also known as Edmonton, Alberta. We want to start off today's webinar in a good way and acknowledge that the lands that flow into the North Saskatchewan River are in Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. Our watershed also features the largest population of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. These lands are the traditional territories, traveling routes, and gathering places of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Dene, and Nakota Sioux people. We recognize and thank the Indigenous people who have cared for this land since time immemorial and whose rich histories, experiences, teachings, languages, and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward as treaty people. We do recognize that watershed management system has in the past and continues to perpetuate a colonial system that excludes and ignores the perspectives offered by Indigenous culture and knowledge. We make this statement as an affirmation that we are committed as an organization and as individuals to improving this relationship for a better watershed for us all. Fulfilling the spirit and intent of the treaties is an ongoing process, and we are committed to building strong and respectful relationships with the Indigenous people of this place and working together to care for the land, water, and living beings who call this watershed home. So I welcome you all to reflect on your place within the watershed, and if you'd like, you can share in the chat where you are dialing in from today. Moving on, our first speaker is Dr. Craig Emmerton. He's an aquatic scientist with Alberta Environment and Protected Areas. Craig co-leads monitoring, evaluation, and reporting activities of Alberta's Lake Water Quality Program and has worked on diverse scientific programs related to the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire and the lake water quality in Alberta's oil sands region. His research involves the use of multidisciplinary approaches to understand the cycling of water, carbon, nutrients, and contaminants in freshwater catchments and how these processes respond to human stressors. During his postdoctoral fellowship and BSc at McMaster University, Craig was trained in whole ecosystem science at Canada's IISD Experimental Lakes area in northwestern Ontario. So that's the International Institute of Sustainable Development. His PhD and MSc research at the University of Alberta and SFU, respectively, focus on watershed cycling of carbon, nutrients, and contaminants in Canada's Arctic and their responses to rapidly changing climates. So take it away, Craig, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. And let's see if this works. Thanks for the introduction. how's that looking? If I go to, how's that?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. Happy to be here today to talk about the NSR. Always happy to do that. Been pretty lucky to work on the NSR and across the basin for several years now. I was actually asked here today to talk a little bit about river health in the North Saskatchewan River and its basin, and pretty complex ask. I'm not going to fully answer it today, but certainly provide some guidance on answering that question, which we're all aiming to answer over here over time. So I'll just work with a general definition of health of being a subject's ability to maintain its functions or be resilient to stress. So with that definition, you can see that that concept of health is both vague and complex at the same time. We can envision taking a bit of a human parallel here. We can take an example of heading to your family doctor because you're exhausted for whatever reason. So what usually happens when you present that to your doctor, you're starting to work from very broad course ideas of what health is to more focused treatments that way. So basically a simple to complex approach. So when you're at the doctor's, for instance, and you give that kind of statement, I'm not feeling well, typically it starts with very broad tests and other measurements such as blood pressure, or they might take a blood panel or urinalysis. So it's trying to get a first go at what the condition is in your body for them to guide afterwards. So we try to take a similar approach to understanding aquatic ecosystem health. So that diagram in the lower right kind of just gets at all the different cycles and interactions between biota that occur in a river system. It's all very complex. It's between living and non-living systems. And there's some outside factors that might impact the health of this ecosystem. So this is where we start to answer a question is the river healthy? You'll want to start with kind of the same approach where you're going from a very broad measurement base to something a bit more targeted. And water quality really does fit that bill as kind of a broad tool to assess ecosystem health. It's kind of like a blood panel for people because it's relatively cheap and easy to do. The results that you get when you dip a bottle or you get a blood test, it echoes baseline processes like your heart condition or what's the salinity concentration in rivers, things like that. So it gives you some guidance on what's happening and pushes you to more holistic assessments of health later on. But for water quality, it's a nice broad way of looking at things. So when you dip bottles or take measurements, you can assess parameters of importance like dissolved oxygen. You can look at if nutrients are very high in the system or if a contaminant concern is in the system or not. And that's what water quality can do for us. So to shift that water quality monitoring approach to the NSR basin, you can see that doing something as supposedly simple as water quality monitoring in the NSR is a big ask. So this basin in Alberta's portion is like, I had to look this up. It's larger than a third of the countries on Earth. It's about 57,000 square kilometers. And you can see from this land use link cover map that it's quite diverse too, right? We go from very high Cordillera Rocky Mountains landscape through rolling foothills, mixed with forests, agriculturalized plains, and large cities. So at the same time, you have quite large rivers up in the headwaters where most of the rainfall is coming from and where most of the water in the NSR is actually comprised. That continues downstream to smaller rivers and smaller streams through the plains regions. And at the same time, it's a really well-used basin as well. So there's forestry activities, oil and gas, agriculture, heavy industry, urbanization, residential development. So when you dip a bottle at any one place, on top of that, including is natural influences on water quality, all that coming together in one dipped bottle, it can be a pretty complex mixture. So it doesn't really tell you what the health is, but it tells you there's a whole lot. It can give you some guidance on what the overall condition is, and you have to start to break down that question afterwards. So in the NSR itself, the main stem of the river has been monitored for water quality roughly monthly for several decades now by both provincial and federal governments, as well as utilities like EPCOR in the city of Edmonton. So this is the most well-used river in the basin. We take a lot of water from it. We use it. It's very important culturally. So this is a very good program to have this as a overall monitoring system. So the federal stations are the red stations, one in the national or near the national park, one at the border, and the Alberta government runs 4 LTRN, so long-term river network stations there at Saunders Camp, near Rocky Mountain House, Devon, and Pecan. So very important monitoring to do, but for us to get a bit more insight into impacts of the main stem river, which is influenced not only by tributaries, but by groundwater and other things. So we want to get into the tributaries because they're more closely connected to landscapes and activities going on there. So recently in 2018, the WaterSHED Monitoring Program came to be, and we selected 20 tributaries to monitor for water quality every month at least, sometimes more than that during high flow events. So it's together, the LTRN system and the WaterSHED system are great. They give you that kind of consistent checkup of basin on water quality and can alert us to a lot of different things. So these are photographs from fixed cameras that are on some of these stations. And I just show it here to give you an idea of how different the rivers can be. There's different landscapes they're draining. There's different flow conditions, different ice conditions. So the WaterSHED program was set up to objectively look at different types of landscapes that are representative across the basin. So quickly, what we measure at these stations, we have technicians from Alberta Environment go out monthly, if not more, during high flow, dipping bottles for physical chemistry measurements, nutrients, metals, trace metals, biologicals. These are quicker, relatively cheaper analysis to run, but gives you a lot of good insight, as you'll see. At the same time, at each of these stations, we have discharge measurements as well, which allows you to find out what the mass of a certain water quality parameter is at any given time at these sites. And as well, thirdly, we have these in-river sondes that we deploy for about 3 weeks at a time that give us 15-minute measurements of very general water quality. So it's a nice, robust system for monitoring. So water quality, to use it as a diagnostic tool, it's still, like I've said a few times, very coarse, but also useful. So with water quality concentrations, you need context because different rivers can have different concentrations naturally, or they respond differently to impacts in the basin. So what that context normally is that we use in terms of a health basis are surface water quality guidelines. So these are a good link to health because they are generated. They use toxicology studies. They basically take different organisms of importance in our northern river systems and expose them to different concentrations of pretty much every parameter that we monitor over time, and basically determines when you start to see lethality at certain concentrations, and then knocks that back for a safety factor. And those are our surface water quality guidelines. So they are good. They get at the living portion of what's in the river system, because if you cross those concentrations, whether it's because of natural processes or because of human-related processes, it's still going to impact potentially these organisms of interest. So another step you can do, this is something under the federal program, is a river water quality index tool where they take several tens of of parameters that have guidelines and try to give you a basic summary of what's going on with those parameters, like how many are beyond guideline in any given sample, how often are they beyond guidelines and how much are they over guidelines. Those can be brought together in a very coarse, simple river water quality index tool that gives you an idea of, is water quality, quote, good? That means not a lot of guidelines being crossed or not very often, up to maybe poor, where we see guidelines crossed more often. And there's other statistical assessments to kind of give you alerts before guidelines are crossed. And that's something that the Alberta government does in their surface water quality frameworks, basically giving us triggers, alarms before we hit guidelines when concentrations are going in a direction towards guideline exceedances. So let's just go to then a few examples of all the water quality data we've collected over the last 4 years from both the WaterSHED Monitoring Program and the long-term river networks, the NSR site. So these are just box plots from all the stations, from the most upstream sites to the most downstream sites. And these 4 parameters that I'm showing, dissolved chloride, total dissolved solids, lower left, total suspended solids, and dissolved organic carbon, we find when you do assessments, statistical assessments, that these 4 parameters match up really well to most of the things that we do monitor. So for instance, dissolved chloride is really connected to agricultural and urbanization. So we tend to see other metals and things like that tend to be high in urbanized streams, like selenium, for instance, match really well with chloride. So they would follow typically that pattern you see in the top left. Similar to total suspended solids, a lot of total metals that have guidelines follow that kind of pattern, as well as dissolved organic carbons, really tightly linked to a lot of organic nutrients as well. So the main take home here is that for each of these 4 parameters, we see this kind of dividing line, which I've kind of labeled natural / anthropogenic. It occurs around the Drayton Valley area, where we actually see big differences in elevation, big differences in soil types, land cover, things like that, as well as human use starts to pick up at the same time, because we don't tend to get agriculture going on really steep areas or really rolling forested foothills. Tends to do better, obviously, where there's more plains and thicker, more rich soils. So they kind of happen hand in hand, where we get this natural change and anthropogenic change. So you can see in a lot of cases, once you hit that dividing line, getting into those plains areas, the concentrations of all these things start to ramp up as a result of going into that different kind of landscape and landscape use. And I've also highlighted here where Edmonton basically starts as well, and it's well known, the chloride issues with northern urban areas as well. And you can kind of see that that's White Mud Creek right in Edmonton that has by far the highest chloride concentration. So it's good. Most of the breakdown here shows kind of a very dilute snowmelt rainfall driven chemistry in these rivers upstream in the foothills and mountains, and very much a lesser rainfall, flatter, more anthropogenically impacted part downstream into the plains. So that's kind of the take home, is that we do have some differences upstream to downstream that are pretty stark for sure. Now, if we bring this down to the guideline question, which is getting more at the health of the ecosystem with our water quality work, we see kind of that same divide. So what we're seeing here is a percent of all samples. This is over a 3-year period from both the WaterSHED and long-term river network stations. This is how often you get a guideline exceedances for all these different types of metals that have guidelines and other things. So the only important thing here is to say that we see the same pattern. Not a lot of guideline exceedances in the upstream area. You get into that Drayton Valley area where we're getting into the plains, thicker soils, more activity. You're starting to see more guideline exceedances. And that's also holds consistent for the agricultural guidelines as well. So I also wanted to point out a bit here too that the NSR shows a little bit of resilience because it's a bigger river, that you don't see as many guideline exceedances in that river itself because you have those groundwater influences and such. So a little bit more resilience there, but still showing that same trend where you're getting more guideline exceedances as you move downstream. So squishing all of these guidelines together into kind of a broad water quality index, we're seeing a lot of the same patterns. So this is North Saskatchewan at Whirlpool Point, where good or excellent water quality typically just means not a lot of guideline exceedances, or if they happen, it's not that frequent or not by that much. And moving downstream through Devon, you're starting to see the number of guideline exceedances start to increase as well. So what that's doing is that because of those patterns, that really is driving a lot of the stewardship that many players have been working on over the past few decades, right? We see that greater impact on our water quality in the downstream area versus the upstream area. So a lot of the work, including work by NSWA, is focused in on that area, but also gives us some pause to think about how important those upper headwater regions are, where most of the river water in the NSR comes from. Fairly untouched good water quality at this point. So source water protection becomes a pretty important factor to keep in mind, as well as the downstream impacts. Also wanted to bring up a lot of progress has been made. So I went back and had a look at some descriptions of the NSR back in the 50s, and to paraphrase, through Edmonton, somebody wrote down that they basically saw lots of garbage along the shorelines. They could see oil and grease slicks in the rivers. Dissolved oxygen was near nil in a lot of places, and overall the productivity of the river was very high. So. And what that did with that lack of oxygen is push out a lot of the kind of more natural pollution intolerant species and replace them with the really robust pollution tolerant species. So until a lot of upgrades to how we deal with garbage and effluents and wastewater, once we've had some improvements in those areas through the 80s and 90s, you're starting to see recovery in the system. You're starting to see some more pollution intolerant species come back in through Edmonton. So progress has been made, but there's still a lot to do. We still see that there's a bit of stress in that downstream environment, not only in the NSR, but in tributaries itself. So that's the crux of a lot of work that we do. So concentrations are important for things that live in there and for water users, but they don't really tell you where things are coming from. So if we had high chloride, if we have high chloride in the system, concentrations don't necessarily tell you where the sources are, whereas loads can do that. So if we're taking concentrations times flow at everywhere we measure, we start to see a mass flow of chloride through the system. And that's what these arrows basically show, from upstream in the mountains to downstream. So dissolved chlorides, I just made this as an example. It kind of shows you what tributaries might be very important for contributing chloride to the system. So white mud being an important one for chloride in this whole basin, as well as unmeasured streams and effluents and things like that through Edmonton also can have a pretty major role in the amount of chloride that's contributed to the system, and that's true of a lot of northern cities. So using loads for these health assessments really helps, because you can start to target where the issues are coming from, and chloride obviously is a big bullseye on how we live in cities. So that we're still working on putting those data sets together, but it's starting to give us a much better basin-wide holistic view of what's going on with water quality. So just lastly, expanding health assessments. So I said earlier, water quality is kind of like your initial blood test. It gives you an idea of where there might be stress, and I think I've demonstrated that using guidelines, it does do that. But it doesn't tell you necessarily how the biota who live in the river are actually doing. Water comes and goes. If it's poor water quality one day, it could be better another day. But things like benthic invertebrates, they live in that water all the time. So they can actually be even a better assessment of health and water quality is, but that would be the next step, is to look at biota. But unfortunately, a lot of these biological studies are really labor intensive and maybe a bit rudimentary in some ways. You're out basically kicking mud into nets to grab species that you have to take them back to the lab, identify them, all those things. So it's a lot of work. It's been done across the basin a few times, but it's not really a monitoring program that you can pull off year to year like water quality. But luckily, that is starting to change. eDNA has been around for a while, certainly in the research community, but it's starting to get cheap enough and more accessible that it might start coming into programs. So eDNA can basically give you an idea of what species are in a river, and in some cases, how if their communities are large and thriving or not, or it can tell you if there's invasive species, things like that. So you can basically do that in a quick dip of a filter, pass water through a filter, and get some of that information about the biota. So we're hopeful a lot of these improvements in biological monitoring will give us a more robust assessment of health over time. But for now, water quality is doing that. It's helping drive stewardship, but there's much more to do. So thank you very much. Lots of people help with the WaterSHED Monitoring Program and the LTRNs, and guess happy to pass it over to Mike now.
Thanks, Craig. I will just reshare here. Perfect. So we also do have a couple questions in the chat now, but I think we will ask those later, and then we will see what happens and see who wants to answer each, because the talks are quite similar. So thanks so much, Craig. And moving on to Mike. So Mike Christensen has been a watershed biologist with EPCOR Utilities since 2016, where his focus is on source water protection and managing the cumulative effects of EPCOR's operations on the North Saskatchewan River. Prior to EPCOR, Mike worked as a consultant for 9 years, focusing on water quality, benthic invertebrates, and algae. He currently serves as the chair of the Alberta Lake Management Society, and he loves canoeing, so he would enjoy hearing any recommendations of where to paddle next summer. So go ahead and throw those in the chat too. Perfect. So I'll let you take it away and stop my share.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just pull that up. Okay, am I sharing the full view?
Looks good, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. So yeah, Mike Christensen, I work at EPCOR, and again, there's going to be a lot of similarities and a lot of overlap with what Craig has already presented. So you'll probably be hearing an echo of a lot of similar themes and comments. But I'm going to take it from a little bit of a different perspective, not from an aquatic ecosystem health perspective, but from a source water protection planning perspective. I'm not flipping screens here. There we go. So you might be wondering, what is source water protection planning? Obviously, as the drinking water provider for Edmonton and surrounding communities, we're obviously interested in providing clean, safe, reliable drinking water for all of our customers. But kind of the question is, well, how do you get clean, safe, reliable drinking water, and how do you ensure it? So obviously, you kind of look in the middle of this diagram here. You obviously have to have a water treatment plant that's functioning properly. You have to have a distribution system that gets water to people's homes. But really where it basically starts is with source water. And you can kind of think of source water as basically kind of raw water that the water treatment plants take up. And kind of just recognizing that if we can kind of protect raw water quality, that makes the job of producing safe, clean drinking water a whole lot easier. Obviously, you can still produce clean drinking water from sometimes not even as great water quality, but obviously basically looking to preserve your source water quality and protect it is a key part to helping to ensure that we have good drinking water quality. And what we kind of have in these circles around it are basically kind of this multi-barrier approach, or what are the things that we can do to help ensure that we continue to have a clean and safe water supply. And so again, there's a lot of things that go on to it, and we can kind of do a whole talk on source water protection, but really kind of you even look at that kind of that first layer kind of around there, we have monitoring. And so obviously that's kind of our connection here to the WaterSHED monitoring program that we've been talking about. So again, a similar graph that kind of Craig has already showed, but maybe focusing a little bit more on the headwaters from an Edmonton perspective. So you can see Edmonton kind of outlined there in gray, and you can basically see kind of the network of tributaries that contribute to the North Saskatchewan River. So again, I think as most people probably know, the North Saskatchewan River is the source water for Edmonton and surrounding communities. But I think sometimes we tend to take a look and say, well, it's the North Saskatchewan River, and just looking at the river itself as a unit, and really kind of forgetting that the river really is the watershed, and really it's all these different tributaries and rivers that join that actually are the North Saskatchewan River. So we can't really forget that. And again, Craig has kind of talked and already showed that like water quality really changes as you kind of move spatially through the system. But also what it does is it really changes temporally as well. It really just changes even day to day, depending on what's happening in the watershed. And just kind of through my talk, I have a couple little camera images just to kind of to liven up the presentation, but just to kind of show just how different our watershed looks like. So we've got the Sifler River there looking nice and pristine, and you can kind of imagine how from a source water perspective, that's maybe an ideal location to get water. And then kind of the second figure I just got a photo of the Clearwater River, not really living up to its name of being Clearwater in a flood stage a couple of years ago. And so you can kind of imagine just how even a river, which is called the Clearwater and is often very clear, can suddenly turn very turbid and have a lot of different challenges from a water treatment perspective very quickly due to some flooding events. Again, similar kind of figure that Craig has already kind of shown, showing the diversity of land cover in our source water area. And again, that really drives a lot of that water quality. We've got the urban environment, and we've already talked a little bit about White Mud Creek. We've got the agricultural zones, which Craig has already kind of highlighted, and then the forested and the montane environments. But recognizing it's not only just even the land use and what's there, it's recognizing kind of the human impact. So this is a figure that I like showing. The data comes from ABMI, and it shows kind of the human footprint in our watershed. And basically kind of where there's blue, it shows that the landscape has been modified. There's some amount of human footprint on that area. And again, it doesn't take long to think about. You realize that, yeah, kind of in and around, obviously, the Edmonton and area that we've basically almost completely modified the landscape. There's very few areas without a human footprint. And as we progressively move further and further upstream, we can see that our footprint becomes less significant, but still definitely there. Not only are we looking at maybe even historical human footprint, but we're also looking at a continued human footprint. We continue to modify the landscape, and as shown as basically the human footprint is continuing to increase in our watershed over time, as provided by ABMI data. Now, I know we're kind of talking about the health of the North Saskatchewan River, and I really want to kind of make a distinction, just kind of pause here for a little bit of when we kind of talk about, say, the health of the river, and then we also kind of maybe talk about the health of our drinking water perspective. And I don't want anyone kind of leaving this chat with maybe a different perspective as we talk about maybe some challenges and health with, say, from a watershed perspective. That's not necessarily the same case from a drinking water quality perspective. Just really want to kind of echo that, like, EPCOR's drinking water, it meets or exceeds all guidelines that we test for. We collect about 13,000 samples a year from various parts of our water treatment to really ensure that water is clean and meets all safety guidelines. And we're basically running about 270,000 tests a year. So if you have any questions about that, we can definitely talk about drinking water. That's not going to be the main focus of my point. I'm going to be talking more about the source water perspective, but EPCOR definitely does its due diligence and then some in terms of making sure that the water quality that we drink is definitely safe. So again, Craig's kind of talked about a number of different parameters and a number of different ways that we can kind of assess, we'll say, health of a system. And I'm going to kind of focus on one kind of parameter. And this parameter we like to call color. Now, color is not a parameter that a lot of people are very familiar with. And even as an aquatic biologist before joining EPCOR, I was really not aware much of this parameter. A simple way of or another way of looking at it is dissolved organic carbon, or total organic carbon, dissolved organic matter. A lot of the scientists will be more familiar with that. And if you still don't really know what I'm talking about, you can kind of see that picture there. It shows basically kind of organic matter in a kind of a gradient among a set of clear bottles. But if you want to see dissolved organic matter or dissolved organic carbon in action, basically leave a couple of leaves in a barrel, put some rainwater in there, let it sit for a week or two, and kind of pour it out. And you kind of get that yellowy tea colory stain kind of material. And that's color or dissolved organic carbon. Now, dissolved organic carbon is obviously, it's a natural process. It's basically the breaking down of organic material, right? And so this is a very completely normal process. But from a water treatment perspective, dissolved organic carbon and color can kind of present a lot of challenges. From a very simple perspective, obviously, we don't want colored water coming out of people's taps. People like clear water. So that's obviously one reason why we want to remove color from our drinking water. But probably from a more important perspective is really color really interferes with basically kind of the treatment and the disinfection of the water. So basically color, the plants have to work harder to remove that color to ensure that that water is treated appropriately. And so what this graph is showing is this is kind of just showing an annual time series and kind of selected a bunch of kind of random years just to kind of show what color does. You can see in the winter time, kind of not surprisingly, color is quite low. There's obviously not a lot of biological processing and runoff happening in the winter months. And then typically, usually every spring, we see these spikes, right? The snow starts to melt, the creeks open up, all the stuff washes off the land. We get a lot more color at our water treatment plants in the spring. And again, there's often a lot of challenges and the plants have to work harder to make sure that that color is removed. We'll also sometimes see some summer storm events, get a little bit more runoff, and we get a little bit more color coming into the river in that perspective. And for the long time, that's kind of what the story of color was. And then all of a sudden, 2016 happened. I had the pleasure of joining EPCOR near the beginning of August 2016, and within a couple quick weeks of me joining, I got a very crash course on what color means and how important it is to water treatment plants. 2016 was actually a pretty boring year from a runoff perspective. It was pretty dry, not a lot happened during the spring. And all of a sudden in August, we got a fairly large rain event, about 50, 60 millimeters of rain across the watershed, which is not that amount. It's a good amount of rain, but nothing particularly remarkable. But all of a sudden, color shot up. And basically, we got the highest color value we basically had ever recorded at the water treatment plants. And the plants had to work really hard, and they were definitely challenged in being able to produce that water. Again, not that drinking water quality was at risk, but just the plants had to work a lot harder to make sure that everyone was getting the amount of water that they wanted. And obviously that color, again, it dropped fairly quickly, but you can even see through the rest of 2016, that color hung on for a long time. And obviously as a watershed biologist, the operators at the water treatment plants were asking us, like, where's this color coming from? Why is it so high? And although we had a lot of theories and a lot of insights of where this color was coming from, we didn't have a lot of really hard concrete data to really kind of point out exactly what was happening. But eventually, kind of in December, that color kind of went away. We kind of breathed a sigh of relief and on we go back to normal. Then all of a sudden, 2 months later, we basically get an early spring runoff in February. We had February of 2017, temperatures in the double digits in the middle of February, and basically kind of the creeks opened up. Again, another really big surprise. Our plants are really used to operating in really clear water conditions during the winter months, and usually creeks opening up in February is not a kind of a common experience. But again, that passed, and we thought, okay, well, 2016, 2017 was kind of a bit of a challenging period, but we're back to normal. And then fast forward a couple of years, and then we have 2019, which I think is the second highest color event that we've basically had on record. And so we've kind of had this challenge over a couple of years where color is kind of popping up and maybe doing some things that are a little bit unusual. And people are kind of asking questions of saying like, well, are these just kind of random events? Is this climate related? Is this landscape related? What is going on? What is driving color? And is there something that we need to do about this? So looking at the WaterSHED Monitoring Program, this is a great program to be able to look and to be able to answer these questions. We had actually started initiating getting the WaterSHED program running before even a lot of these high color events were even starting to pop up, but recognizing this is exactly what this program was designed for. Again, Craig has already showed this figure, but looking especially from like an upstream perspective, you can start looking at a lot of the major creeks and stuff that enter the North Saskatchewan River above Edmonton, and you basically see that we've actually covered basically all the major the rivers that join the North Saskatchewan. And basically we're covering about 74% of the land mass is basically being captured by the WaterSHED Monitoring Program. So there are still smaller tributaries and stuff that add, but when we're starting to look from a perspective like where is color coming from, This program was totally designed to be able to answer that question, even though that was not the original inherent intent of starting up the monitoring program. Again, Craig has already mentioned this, but we've got 20 water quality monitoring stations across the watershed. We've got the sondes, which are very helpful. We've got the cameras set up, which are taking photos of those creeks regularly. Through this program to date, we've been able to collect over, and Alberta Environment and Parks has been collecting, Alberta Environment Protected Areas, sorry, got to keep that name change in there. 800 grab samples have been collected upstream of Edmonton. And particularly what's been happening too is new flow monitoring stations have been added upstream of Edmonton. There were previously some creeks and rivers that basically flow wasn't being monitored, and Craig has already talked about the importance of the loads, and we'll get into that a little bit as well. But adding those new flow monitoring stations upstream of Edmonton is a huge benefit and a huge addition to this program. And again, also one new meteorological station, recognizing there's data gaps in our meteorological data as well. And that is definitely helpful to informing this program. So just to kind of show you of what data we had, say, before WaterSHED and what data we've had after. So the blue bars show the number of samples from each of the creeks, specifically relating to color data. So again, color is a parameter that's maybe not analyzed by everybody, but you can see that, so the historical data goes back even into the 1970s. So some creeks like Tomahawk and Strawberry and Rose were sampled fairly effectively. But you can see rivers like Cline, Siffler, and Bighorn, where actually a lot of the water is coming from, have basically almost no color data. So when we get asked the question, based on historic data, where is color coming from? We start looking at our upper watershed, and we've got really big question marks. Since the monitoring program started in 2019, we got 4 years of data. You can start seeing we've actually significantly increased that amount of data. So not only is the number of samples increased, but really, again, combined with the sonde data, combined with the flow monitoring gauge data, the more robust monitoring program that we've been able to develop. Not only do we have more samples, we've actually got a lot better data to be able to kind of infer what is happening with color in the watershed. So again, Craig's already kind of presented this. I just stole this figure from him just because it kind of helped tell the story. Again, Craig also set this up really well. So again, this is dissolved organic carbon. So again, we're kind of shifting from color to dissolved organic carbon. And again, so what we could kind of see, the concentrations in the headwaters are typically less than the concentrations we would see kind of in that agricultural zone. So again, that's helpful information. It starts to know what these concentrations are. But again, what Craig has kind of talked about, the concentrations of dissolved organic carbon actually really aren't that interesting to us. We need to kind of pair that together with the flow data. We want to know how much, like how many kilograms and tons of this organic material is coming off, to be able to get at that question of saying, where is this actually coming from? And so again, I'm stealing more data and slides from Craig, and Craig's done a fantastic job of helping to pull this data together. Craig was showing some of these chloride graphs before, but now this is the similar types of graphs showing dissolved organic carbon. So you can see at the top of the slide is basically the kind of the headwaters, and as we move down, we're moving towards Edmonton and downstream of Edmonton. And you can start to see where the inputs are coming in. And so what you can kind of see from well, actually, there's a couple different things we can see. So I've got the figures here from 2019, 2020, and 2021. You can see these figures actually look really different year to year, right? And there's a lot of differences in the precipitation and the loading that's going on in these different years. We've got some really wet years in 2019 and 2020, which is really driving and running that material off the landscape. And then we've got 2021, which was relatively quite a dry year, and basically quite a lot less material basically moved off the into the river that year. So definitely differences. The other thing too is you can start looking at the width of those arrows of the little creeks that are coming in, and you can start to see some things that are kind of interesting. So Strawberry Creek, right, and Modeste Creek, maybe some of those agricultural creeks kind of in the middle of the watershed there, they had some of the highest concentrations, but they actually have, relatively speaking, not the highest loads, especially from an annual perspective. And some of the other creeks, we'll say Brazeau, Nordag, Baptiste, and Clearwater, well, they had actually some lower concentrations, but from an annual perspective, they're actually contributing more load, simply just because, again, they're bigger rivers and they're flowing for a longer portion of the year. So again, this really kind of starts to help address and answer the question, where is color actually coming from in our watershed? This is another way too that although annual load is definitely important, and Craig, thanks for pulling those figures together, the annual load can actually be really misleading from a water treatment perspective, because again, we're not really too concerned about where it is coming from over an entire year. We really want to know where is it coming from in a specific point in time. So I kind of took the same 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021, and what these graphs are showing is we take a look at the North Saskatchewan River in Edmonton and we say, what percentage of that water is coming from some of our upstream agricultural creeks? So again, we've got a bunch of water in Edmonton. And so you look in 2019, April 2019, over 20% of the water in the North Saskatchewan River is coming from the agricultural streams of Weed, Strawberry, Modeste, and Tomahawk. Those are relatively small creeks, but during spring runoff, they are huge contributors to the water quantity and quality that we see in the North Saskatchewan River. So again, so the annual perspective, we might see Strawberry Creek has a very small arrow from its annual load, but I can almost guarantee you that almost all of that load is coming during like maybe a couple weeks period, basically that we see there in April of 2019. Then we kind of fast forward to 2020 as well, and you can start to see during some of these like late spring and summer rain events, we're getting 20, 30, even 40% of the North Saskatchewan River is that we see in Edmonton is coming from these agricultural creeks. So this is just the flow data. This isn't the load. So what I need to start doing is start to look at some of Craig's data, and we need to continue to work on this data to improve it. So I want to start getting into that question of saying, okay, Strawberry Creek might not be significant from an annual perspective, but okay, look at that high peak in the middle of May there in 2020. I can almost guarantee you Strawberry Creek and Modeste Creek are playing critical roles during that very brief period of time. And so that's a period of ongoing work that we are going to keep working on. So how do we define river health? Again, as Craig's kind of mentioned, this is a complex question. There's not a simple answer to this. Again, Craig was talking a lot more from an aquatic ecosystem health perspective, and that's a good and right way to look at river health. I'm kind of looking at it maybe from a different perspective, from how water treatment plants might view river health. Again, similar methods, similar things, but we're going to be looking at different parameters, and we might actually define health in different ways depending on how we're looking at it. I know I'm kind of running out of time here. I'm just going to kind of try to wrap this up. Obviously, we want to know, we can see what the creeks are doing today, but again, it's hard to measure what the health of a creek is today because we don't really know what that creek was like pre-disturbance. So we can see maybe a lot of colors coming off some of these agricultural creeks or other rivers, but what was that creek operating like before? Has color always come off these creeks in large abundances? Has it actually come off even more? How is it doing now compared to what it was doing pre-disturbance? So again, it's kind of hard to assign a label of healthy or unhealthy to something that we actually don't really know what it was like beforehand. And even at what point does a change become unhealthy? Craig has mentioned there's for certain parameters, there's guidelines like chloride, and we can objectively say something is healthy or unhealthy. But for a parameter like color or dissolved organic carbon, there's not really a level it's not a toxic effect of this material. So at what point is saying maybe there's more color in the watershed? Well, do we want to start calling this unhealthy or not? And so again, I've been wrestling with this question the past couple of weeks of like river health and how do we assign healthy? And I think from a general EPCOR perspective, we don't try to label it this way, and we really look at kind of managing and mitigating our risks and understanding that yes, water quality it changes spatially, it changes temporally. What are we going to do from a water treatment perspective to manage these risks? But also, what are we doing from a watershed and source water protection perspective to help manage these risks? And really, what we really want to see is no further degradation in water quality. The water treatment plants have been operating for years, and they've been operating effectively. We know they can handle the current water quality conditions. Obviously, we want to ensure and protect to make sure that there's not further declines in water quality so that they don't negatively impact the water treatment plants into the future. Again, basically, so we've been doing WaterSHED for 4 years. In some ways, people would say, okay, like what have you learned over 4 years? And in some ways, we've learned a lot. In some ways, we're actually just beginning our process of understanding. So we've got a lot better knowledge of where color and other parameters are coming from. We know what these non-point sources are. We know how they change temporally and spatially. That's been a key success of the program. But really, there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know. What are the actual drivers? What are the actual mechanisms? So we know it's coming off Strawberry Creek. Well, why is it coming off Strawberry Creek or other rivers? What is the linkage between the land use, the land cover, the precipitation, and how does that change? And specifically, how does it happen now? But what's also going to happen into the future? We started seeing changes in climate and further changes in land use. And again, this is just my last slide of just kind of what are our next steps. Obviously, we're going to continue the monitoring. We're going to continue the WaterSHED monitoring program for a number of years. We're going to continue to collaborate. Again, EPCOR is obviously just one partner in this program. We're going to continue working with stakeholders and academics and continuing to work on this data. Some of the next steps we need to start doing is starting to the modeling and starting to really kind of understand the mechanisms and start being able to do better at predicting. And then, yeah, again, getting a better understanding of what these actual drivers are on the landscape that are resulting in these changes in loads. And that is the end of my presentation.
Fascinating. Thanks so much, Mike. And I believe we do have some questions in the chat that Kayla is going to be fielding to both you and Craig.
Yeah, definitely. We had some questions from Craig's first presentation, but either Craig or Mike, either or can answer them. The first one's from Shelley. She asked, it has been mentioned that drug content remains in city water tests. Is this found at much lesser levels in rural areas?
Yeah, that's been a topic of interest in anybody who monitors, right, is getting into the new water quality parameters of concern, right? So yes, for most urban areas that I've seen in the literature, and I'm sure Mike could chime in too, because they've done a little bit of this work as well. Yeah, drugs any types of drugs people use in any great amounts as a population are detectable. Versus rural areas, I really think it's a population issue. The rural areas are not don't have the population nor the effluent volume that Edmonton would. So you may not get enough mass of people to actually detect drugs in rural systems, especially in the river. You might in some of the sewage lagoons pick it up, but in terms of the NSR, not so much. That's why Edmonton kind of overwhelms everything. But I live out in the country. I read RCMP reports. The drug use is probably no different in rural areas than in the city. I think it's just mostly a population issue if you can detect it or not. I don't know if that's along the lines you were thinking, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to again point out I really focus on the source water. I do not focus my efforts on the drinking water. So I have not spent a lot of time actually looking at what the treated drinking water qualities are. I definitely know you do get hits of some drugs in raw water, but I'm not able to speak. If someone wants to follow up, we can chat about it later and we can start pulling up some of the data and looking at raw water, treated water quality. But I think it really comes back down to what's your source water. I don't think you can really say an urban versus a rural, because I think it comes back down to the question of, well, where's your source of your water? If your source of your water is maybe downstream of a lot of urban or other like wastewater impacts where those drugs can get into the system, then I'd say you could probably find them there. Versus a rural area where very few people are upstream of you, you're probably not going to find them. So again, I don't think it's an urban-rural divide. I think it's a source water. Where's your source water from? That's probably where the better answer is.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't unmute for a second. I think it's a great response. Thanks, guys. We have another question from Wendell asking, how was the water quality index created and what went into it?
Yeah, I know Wendell. He used to work with us for a long time. Hey, how are you? I hope you're good. So Wendell, you'll remember we used to have a water quality index for Alberta, but this is the federal water quality index. They treated things a little bit differently federally. So basically bringing together anywhere between 10 and 30 different parameters and assessing guideline like frequency of crossings of guidelines, how many parameters cross, and by how much. So that's all put together in pretty simple mathematical equations, and then kind of brought all together and standardized to a 0 to 100 score, based on higher score being fewer guideline exceedances and lower scores meaning more. The provincial version of this wasn't quite as robust. There were fewer parameters, resulting in a lot more confusing results. I'm not saying the federal one is the best of the best tools. It's a very coarse guidance tool because it doesn't respond well to rainfalls that might occur in between the time you sample. Our rivers are really responsive to snow melt and rainfall, so we're missing a lot of that in our sampling. So the index should be used with caution for sure. It's more of a coarse guidance tool. We don't really rely on it to say, and this is part of the reason why we dropped it in Alberta. We don't rely on it to say this is good, excellent water, this is poor. There's a lot of natural and human caused influences on that.
Yeah, and I echo Craig's comments. I think what it does is it takes a very complicated picture and tries to reduce it down to a single number or single statement. And I think that's really hard to do. I understand that I like to use it. It gives a simple answer to a complicated question, but it's probably overly simplistic, and it probably actually misses a lot of things by saying something's good or bad without really getting into the nuances of what's actually happening.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why I say at least guidelines still do mean something. They're related to how organisms can live in those concentrations if they are doing well or can't. So that's why I do like guidelines generally, but it's more of a way how we monitor systems. We only get out there maybe monthly, maybe twice a month if we're lucky. And as Mike said, this stuff can change on an hourly basis. So I'm hoping for improvements in indices like this in the future as we start using SONs more and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Wendell also has another question asking what the purposes of the cameras are.
Yeah, I guess we can both answer this because we may have different answers. Certainly from my perspective and our field staff perspective, the cameras are really invaluable. In the straightforward sense, it allows our field staff to determine what the conditions are on site when they go to monitor or when they go to do field visits. If it looks like it's unsafe or not able to do monitoring that day, it really saves them a trip and looking to do it maybe a day or two after. We couldn't do that before. They would go out and say, oh, conditions aren't great, and miss a sample. Other things, we've actually seen beaver influence on these systems where the flow stations might start showing some really weird data. You can actually see beavers, and in some cases you can see their breathing hole on the camera over time. So you can start to see those influences. Ice on and ice off is really valuable. That's something we have zero data on. And we can actually see ice jam events too. I had a picture on mine from Rose Creek that had a pretty major for it, ice jamming event, which really messes up flow measurements and causes a lot of havoc. So we would not have picked that up unless we had a field staff on site. And also dam bursts, like we actually can see pretty clearly when dams break up and blow apart on these cameras. So they're really good. I like them a lot, and they're helpful.
Yeah, I think it gives a lot of context to that flow measurement as well. Again, sometimes you see like a water level going up, and it's like, well, why is it going up? Okay, well, there's an ice jam, or okay, it's actually flooding. It really started off from EPCOR is really interested in spring runoff and knowing basically exactly when the creeks upstream of Edmonton start to melt. And we actually kind of proposed this. Can we get one camera on one creek so we can see when spring runoff is? Because we used to have to either drive out there ourselves or rely on local landowners to actually tell us when the creek was breaking up. And so it started off with probably getting one camera on one creek, basically spawned and getting cameras basically on almost all the creeks.
Yeah, definitely. Jill and I, oh, sorry, if you keep going.
Oh, you're probably going to say what I was going to say. Like the time lapses you guys work on are awesome.
Yeah, and just, yeah, I know, and so there's even, I think, just even a human element of like, you can actually like basically go through the watershed. You can take a little tour right from your desktop and seeing what the watershed looks like. And again, those time lapses, taking 365 days of photos and putting it into one video and seeing those changes over the year, they're fantastic. I think it's a great way to even educate. It was never really designed, I guess, as an outreach and education tool, but it kind of became that.
Yeah, definitely. That was exactly what I was going to say, because one of the videos I worked on for Adamosway Creek, you could actually see when the dam broke. So that was pretty cool too. I don't know if we have time for any more questions, but feel like we're kind of cutting down to the wire, but there were 2 more. I can always share them with you guys later, or
Yeah, we can follow up later.
Yeah, I just see the if the water quality index tools
Yes.
online. Yeah, if you type in federal government of Canada river water quality index, there's plenty of websites on there. But you can also share my my email with Michelle as well if that comes up.
Great, sounds good. So yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in today. A quick reminder that the recording will be available online, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel to check out all of those and to see some of those time-lapse videos that we mentioned. You can also check out more info and stay up to date on events in the watershed and with our in-stream newsletter. And keep in mind that we'll be having our winter webinar series from February to April, and the speakers will be announced soon. So thank you everyone so much for tuning in.